The whispers of rebellion, the threat of invasion, and the ambition of a young general in the east hinted at a coming storm that would decide whether Rome would endure or crumble forever. The true struggle for the soul of the empire was about to begin, and no one could predict who would emerge victorious. The sun rose over the Tiber River, casting a cold light on the marble pillars of the Senate. Rome, once the heart of the world, now trembled under the weight of corruption, civil wars, and relentless invasions. The streets were quieter than they should have been. The crowds that once cheered for gladiators and celebrated the triumphs of generals now murmured in fear. Whispers of rebellion and betrayal floated through the forums like a poisonous mist, and no citizen dared speak too loudly of the decay that gnawed at their empire. The sun rose, pale and hesitant, over the eastern provinces of the empire. Where once the lands had teemed with Roman soldiers, now sparse garrisons held crumbling fortresses, struggling to maintain authority. The air was thick with rumors of Constantine, the ambitious young general whose name stirred both hope and fear. From the palaces of Constantinople to the villages of the Danube frontier, men and women whispered of the coming storm, of a new ruler who could either save or shatter the empire. In the west, Emperor Maximian, co-ruler under Diocletian's tetrarchy, faced an empire unraveling under his very gaze. Governors ignored imperial edicts. Local armies acted on their own whims, and the treasury, once overflowing with tribute, now struggled to fund even the most essential defenses. In his chambers, Maximian pored over maps and letters, his mind calculating alliances, betrayals, and the cost of every decision. Every choice could spark rebellion or invite foreign invasion, yet every day left him fewer options. Meanwhile, Constantine moved with careful precision. He understood that military might alone was insufficient. Loyalty had to be earned, and the hearts of men could be won as easily as their swords. In secret meetings with generals, provincial leaders, and even merchants, he promised stability, wealth, and honor. Those who had long despaired at Rome's decline began to see in him a figure of destiny, a man who could command armies and inspire devotion where emperors before had only demanded obedience. Yet even as alliances formed, the shadows of betrayal crept closer. Within the imperial court, ambitious advisors plotted to undermine each other. Senators coveted influence, generals coveted titles, and the ghosts of past betrayals haunted every decision. Trust was a currency as rare as gold, and deception flowed more freely than the Tiber itself. One wrong move could bring ruin not only to a man, but to entire legions, entire provinces. Across the Rhine, the Germanic tribes sensed weakness and opportunity. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks tested Roman defenses with raids that grew bolder by the week. Villages were sacked, towns burned, and the local populations either fled or were enslaved. The empire's frontier no longer represented a line of defense, but a precarious barrier barely holding back the storm of barbarian ambition. The soldiers who remained fought valiantly, yet many wondered if their sacrifices were futile. Back in Rome, Marcus Aurelius Julianus, the young senator, observed these events with increasing anxiety. The city's people were restless, their loyalty frayed by heavy taxation, famine, and the constant threat of invasion. The Senate debated endlessly, but debate accomplished little. Marcus began to realize that Rome's fate would not be decided by speeches or decrees, but by the cunning and courage of those willing to seize power at the right moment. He understood that the empire's survival depended on action, not rhetoric. In the east, Constantine's rise became impossible to ignore. Provinces that had once resisted imperial authority began swearing allegiance to him, seeing in his leadership a promise of protection and prosperity. Soldiers deserted their commanders to join his ranks, inspired by the belief that this young general could restore order and dignity to the empire. And yet Constantine was not blind to the dangers he faced. Every victory brought envy, and every alliance invited betrayal. He knew that to survive, he would have to navigate a labyrinth of politics, war, and personal ambition with unmatched skill. Amid the turmoil, strange signs and omens unsettled the people. Fires in distant cities, sudden storms along the coasts, and mysterious illnesses in the provinces were interpreted as warnings from the gods. Priests and prophets declared that the empire teetered on the edge of divine judgment. Some citizens turned to faith for solace, while others looked to the sword. It became increasingly clear Rome's fate would be shaped by those bold enough to grasp it, and by those foolish enough to underestimate its enemies. As the months passed, the fractures in the empire widened. Diocletian's reforms, though ingenious, could no longer restrain ambition, greed, or the relentless pressures from without. The Tetrarchy, once a symbol of unity, now revealed its fragility. Co-emperors quarreled, governors acted independently, and generals in the palace, Emperor Diocletian's shadow stretched long across the cold stone floors. Though decades earlier he had brought stability and order with his reforms, even he could feel the fragility beneath the surface. Provinces rioted, generals claimed titles without his sanction, and outside the borders, Germanic tribes and Huns pushed against Rome's weakened defenses. Diocletian's eyes, once sharp and commanding, now lingered on reports of tax revolts in Africa, army mutinies in Gaul, and the looming threat of barbarian incursions across the Danube. The empire he sought to save seemed almost determined to fall apart. Among the senators, some clung desperately to the past. The glory of Rome was no longer in triumphal arches or the roar of the Colosseum, but in the faded memories of senators who still wore the purple toga as a badge of honor. Marcus Aurelius Julianus, a young senator with ambition in his heart and fear in his eyes, observed the disarray quietly. He knew the emperor's reforms had divided the ruling class, and power no longer belonged to Rome itself, but to whoever commanded the loyalty of the armies. Yet even in this age of uncertainty, life went on. Merchants sold their wares in the forum, children played near the aqueducts, and priests whispered prayers to gods who seemed increasingly distant. But the air was thick with tension. Letters from the frontiers spoke of barbarian invasions. Rumors swirled of a new, unstoppable force moving from the east. Rome's military, once a symbol of unchallenged might, was now a patchwork of mercenaries, local levies, and old legions whose discipline had waned. Diocletian, ever pragmatic, made a decision that would echo through history. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, appointing co-emperors to maintain control over distant provinces. This tetrarchy, as it came to be known, was meant to create stability, to prevent the chaos that had toppled previous dynasties. But no reform, no matter how clever, could fully contain the ambitions, jealousies, and fears of men whose loyalty was as fleeting as the wind. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantine, a young and ambitious general, observed the political shifts with keen interest. Though still distant from the throne, he understood the power of strategy, loyalty, and propaganda. He would rise, he believed, not only through the sword, but through the hearts and minds of those who still revered Rome's divine destiny. His ambition was a spark in a world of smoke and shadows, one that could ignite either salvation or further destruction. The empire's borders shivered with danger. Germanic tribes moved stealthily through the forests of Gaul. The Visigoths pushed southward, seeking fertile lands. The Persians in the east tested the limits of Roman fortifications. Every day brought new reports of villages burned, citizens enslaved, and fortresses abandoned. Rome's enemies were no longer distant threats. They were everywhere, testing the empire's resilience and the emperor's will. Amidst the turmoil, ordinary Romans tried to live normal lives. In dimly lit insulae, families huddled together, listening to rumors of imperial intrigue. In the marketplaces, traders whispered about the latest consular decrees and rising taxes, while children chased each other around the crumbling columns of temples. Life persisted in defiance of decay, yet everyone sensed that the end of an era was near, and so the stage was set. The emperors, generals, senators, and barbarians alike moved their pieces across the board. Every decision, every betrayal, every fleeting moment of courage or cowardice would shape the fate of Rome. The old glory was fading, but the echoes of its power still resonated in every corner of the empire. A storm was gathering, one that would not distinguish between friend and foe. As night fell over the capital, the flickering torches along the Palatine Hill cast long shadows over Diocletian's chambers. He knew his reforms might outlast him, but the tides of history were already shifting. Across the empire, men who thirsted for power, vengeance, or survival began to stir. The age of weak emperors, bold generals, and unstoppable invaders was dawning, and in the distance, beyond the mountains and rivers, a new force, ambitious, ruthless, and relentless, waited for its chance to claim the legacy of Rome. The empire had survived centuries, but its most perilous chapter was only beginning. The rulers of the late empire, bound by ambition and fear, were about to learn that power alone could not save Rome. And as one emperor plotted, another rose in silence, ready to seize the moment when the world's greatest city trembled on the brink of collapse. And then came the first true clash that would signal a new era. On the plains of northern Gaul, a coalition of Germanic tribes engaged a Roman army led by one of Constantine's allies. The battle was brutal and decisive. Roman discipline clashed with the ferocity of the invaders, and the outcome would echo across the provinces. The survivors returned with tales of heroism, betrayal, and devastation. News of the battle reached the capital, shaking the already fragile confidence of the emperor and senators alike. Marcus Aurelius Julianus realized that Rome's survival depended on seizing the moment. He began to consider dangerous alliances, questioning old loyalties, and weighing risks that could determine life or death. Every choice he made was a step toward shaping the empire's destiny, but with each step, the shadows of treachery grew longer. And Constantine, observing from the east, prepared for his own move. His forces grew stronger, his reputation unshakable, and his vision of a unified, revitalized empire crystal clear. He knew that Rome would not be conquered by force alone. It would be claimed through strategy, alliances, and the ability to inspire devotion, even in times of chaos. The empire stood at a crossroads. Its rulers were tested, its armies stretched, and its citizens anxious. Every decision, every act of courage, every betrayal would reverberate through history. Rome's twilight was far from over, and yet the spark of transformation had been ignited. The morning mist hung low over the Tiber, concealing the city in a ghostly silence. Rome, battered by decades of turmoil, awaited its fate. The streets were no longer filled with celebration or chatter. Fear and anticipation had replaced both. From the marble halls of the Palatine Hill to the crumbling gates along the walls, the empire seemed to hold its breath. The rulers of the late empire had fought to survive, but now the moment of reckoning had arrived. In the east, Constantine prepared his forces. His rise had been methodical, calculated, and relentless. Every alliance he forged, every province he claimed, had brought him closer to his ultimate goal: unifying an empire fractured by greed, rebellion, and war. Soldiers revered him, seeing in him the embodiment of Roman resilience. Citizens whispered that he had been chosen by fate itself, a man destined to restore the empire's former glory. Yet Constantine knew destiny alone could not secure victory. Strategy, cunning, and the loyalty of men were his weapons. Meanwhile, in the west, Emperor Maxentius braced for the confrontation that all feared. The Tiber's waters mirrored his unease. Reports of Constantine's advances reached him daily, each one a reminder that his authority was waning. Maxentius had built his rule on force, fear, and tradition, but the empire had changed. Soldiers defected, cities hesitated, and even his own advisors questioned his judgment. The looming battle was not merely about territory, it was a clash of vision, of leadership, and of Rome's very soul. In Rome, Marcus Aurelius Julianus moved carefully through the political labyrinth. Every whisper in the Senate, every maneuver in the city was a potential turning point. He had seen the cracks in the imperial system widen, the generals' ambitions collide, and the people's loyalty falter. Now more than ever, he realized that survival required not just wisdom, but courage. Every choice he made could either save lives or doom the city to chaos. The armies assembled on the plains outside Rome, banners fluttering in the wind, spears glinting under the sun. Constantine's legions, disciplined and motivated, faced Maxentius's forces, seasoned yet uncertain. The tension was palpable. Every soldier understood that the coming clash could determine the empire's destiny. Drums echoed across the fields, signaling the start of a confrontation whose outcome would resonate far beyond the battlefield. The first clash was brutal. Cavalry charges, volleys of arrows, and the clash of steel filled the air with chaos and blood. The Romans fought fiercely, yet the unpredictability of war turned even the best-laid plans into chaos. Generals fell, soldiers wavered, and the tide of battle shifted with every hour. Constantine's strategic brilliance became evident. He anticipated enemy moves, exploited weaknesses, and inspired his men to push beyond exhaustion. Amid the fighting, moments of heroism and tragedy unfolded. Marcus Aurelius Julianus, watching from the city walls, realized that history was being written in real time. The empire's rulers were not merely playing a game of power. They were shaping the destiny of millions, deciding the fate of civilization itself. In the chaos, loyalty was tested, courage rewarded, and ambition exposed. Slowly, the battle tilted. Constantine's forces gained the upper hand, their discipline and resolve overcoming Maxentius' strength and numbers. The turning point came when a daring maneuver breached the enemy's center, sending shockwaves of panic through the Western legions. Maxentius, faced with inevitable defeat, made a desperate attempt to rally his troops. But the river Tiber, swollen from recent rains, became a final barrier. In a dramatic and tragic turn, Maxentius fell, swept away by both the waters and the tides of history. As silence fell over the battlefield, the cost of victory was clear. Thousands lay dead or wounded, cities had suffered, and the empire's people were weary from decades of war. Yet amidst the devastation, a new hope emerged. Constantine, standing among the survivors, looked not only to the future of Rome, but to the rebuilding of an empire torn apart by greed, ambition, and relentless conflict. His vision was no longer of conquest, but of unity, stability, and renewal. Back in the Senate, Marcus Aurelius Julianus reflected on the events that had transpired. Rome had survived, yet the era of weak emperors and fractured power had ended. The empire's survival now depended on leadership, strategy, and the ability to inspire loyalty and devotion. Constantine's rise had proven that a single, determined ruler could change the course of history. Yet it also reminded all that the forces of ambition, betrayal, and human frailty were never far away. Across the empire, news of the battle and Maxentius's fall spread quickly. Provinces swore allegiance to Constantine, armies rallied behind his banners, and citizens dared to hope once more. The empire, battered and weary, began the slow process of recovery. Temples were rebuilt, cities restored, and the machinery of governance repaired. Constantine's vision for a renewed Rome, one that could endure despite internal weakness and external threats, began to take shape. Yet even as stability returned, questions lingered. Could any emperor truly safeguard the empire against the relentless pressures from within and without? Would the lessons of the past guide future rulers, or would ambition and folly repeat history's mistakes? The shadows of the late empire remained, whispering that power alone was never enough, and that vigilance, wisdom, and courage were the true pillars of survival. Ending hook for Part 3. As Constantine stood at the heart of a reunited empire, his eyes turned to the horizon. New threats loomed, and the legacy of Rome's decline lingered like a shadow over every city and province. The rulers of the late empire had fought, bled, and died for power. Yet the ultimate question remained: could even the greatest emperor secure the empire's future? Or was Rome destined to face the trials of time and history once more? The story of late Rome was far from over. It had only entered a new chapter. The sun rose slowly over Constantinople, the new eastern capital of the empire, shimmering like a jewel against the waters of the Bosporus. Constantine had triumphed, yet victory brought new challenges. Rome, though temporarily unified, was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. The empire's wounds ran deep. Decades of war, corruption, and neglect had left provinces destabilized, cities crumbling, and the people weary. The emperor understood that holding the empire together would require more than military strength. It would demand vision, diplomacy, and unwavering authority. In the West, the remnants of Maxentius' supporters either fled or submitted. Cities that had resisted imperial rule now faced the task of reconciliation. Governors, generals, and local magistrates were cautious. Some were loyal, others calculating, but all knew that Constantine's authority was absolute. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Yet even as he consolidated control, Constantine sensed the fragility beneath the surface. The empire's unity depended not just on victory, but on reforms that could withstand time and human ambition. One of Constantine's first acts was to reorganize the administration. Provinces were restructured, tax systems reformed, and the army strengthened with clear lines of command. He sought to build a legacy that went beyond conquest, creating institutions that could endure despite the failures of past rulers. Yet resistance persisted. Corruption did not vanish overnight, and many in the Senate and provincial administrations resented the emperor's strict oversight. The old Rome had been accustomed to power wielded through privilege. Now it would answer to merit and loyalty. Religious transformation also became central to Constantine's reign. Christianity, long persecuted, now found favor under imperial protection. Temples to the old gods still stood, but churches rose alongside them, signaling a profound shift in the cultural and spiritual identity of the empire. Constantine's policies were pragmatic. He sought to unify the people under a shared moral and spiritual framework, hoping to create stability where political loyalty alone had failed. This shift was controversial, drawing both fervent support and bitter opposition, yet it reshaped Rome's social fabric. Yet even in this age of reconstruction, shadows lingered. The lessons of the past, civil wars, weak emperors, and relentless external pressures were never far from the minds of both rulers and citizens. Every triumph carried the seed of future challenges, and the empire's survival remained a constant balancing act between ambition, loyalty, and foresight. The late empire had been forged through crisis, and its endurance depended on the capacity of its leaders to learn from history. As decades passed, Constantine's influence reshaped the map of the empire. Constantinople grew into a city of unprecedented power and splendor, serving as a new heart for the eastern provinces. The West remained fragile, yet bound to the emperor's authority through careful alliances and the projection of military might. The Roman Empire had changed forever, both in structure and spirit, yet it retained the enduring essence of its legacy: resilience, ambition, and the capacity to adapt in the face of overwhelming challenges. Amidst the grandeur of Constantinople, Constantine often reflected on the cost of his victories. Wars fought, cities destroyed, lives lost. Rome's survival had demanded sacrifices few could comprehend. He knew that history would judge him not only for triumphs, but for the ways in which he had navigated the empire's endless complexities. And as he gazed upon the new capital, he understood that the struggle for Rome's soul was never truly over. It merely evolved with the passage of time. The golden age Constantine envisioned did not last. Empires built on the will of one man rarely do. When he died, the empire mourned the passing of a legend, but beneath the sorrow, ambition stirred like a serpent. The emperor's sons inherited a realm vast, powerful, and fragile. The unity Constantine had fought for was now theirs to preserve, or to destroy. The empire was divided once again, not by foreign invasion but by blood. Constantine's heirs, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II, each believed himself destined to rule. Rome had one throne, yet three crowns sought it. Old rivalries, quiet during their father's lifetime, now burst into open hostility. Provinces that had just begun to heal from decades of civil war once again felt the tremor of marching legions. In Constantinople, Constantius II, shrewd and calculating, consolidated power in the east. He was a man of cold intellect and relentless focus, determined to preserve his father's legacy by any means. In the west, Constantine II and Constans governed uneasily, their alliance built on suspicion. The empire, so recently unified under a single vision, now fractured along the lines of family ambition and mistrust. The Senate, weary of bloodshed, pleaded for restraint. But the old Rome's authority was gone. True power lay with the armies. Generals swore loyalty not to the idea of the empire, but to the man who could promise victory and reward. Soldiers marched once again under banners that divided more than they united. Brothers faced brothers across battlefields once sanctified by their fathers' triumphs. In Gaul, Constantine II struck first, attempting to seize territories from Constans. The campaign began with swift success, but pride and overconfidence blinded him. In a sudden reversal, Constans' forces ambushed his brother's army. The battle was brief, brutal, and final. Constantine II fell, and the empire mourned another emperor lost, not to enemies, but to ambition. Constans ruled the West for a time with surprising vigor. He strengthened defenses, curbed corruption, and maintained uneasy peace with his surviving brother. Yet even he could not escape the shadow of politics. Generals whispered, conspirators plotted, and loyalty eroded as quickly as trust. Eventually, betrayal found him too. In a remote fortress, surrounded by men who once swore allegiance, Constans was murdered. Another son of Constantine consumed by the hunger for power. Now, only Constantius II remained, emperor of a battered yet surviving empire. Alone on the throne, he faced challenges from all sides, the Persians pressing from the east, the Goths advancing from the north, and unrest brewing within his own cities. The once mighty Roman world, though still vast, began to feel the strain of its size, its decadence, and its dependence on fragile alliances. But history has a way of birthing greatness from chaos. Amidst the turmoil, a new figure emerged, Julian, later called the Apostate, a nephew of Constantine. Educated, philosophical, and charismatic, Julian sought not only to rule, but to restore the intellectual and cultural soul of the empire. Where Constantine had embraced Christianity as a unifying force, Julian sought to revive the old gods, believing Rome's strength lay in its traditions and philosophy. His reign was brief but brilliant. He led campaigns with the courage of a soldier and the vision of a scholar. Under his command, the legions once again tasted victory, pushing back the empire's enemies and restoring hope. Yet his reforms, his ideas, and his defiance of the new religious order made him a target of both admiration and hatred. Fate, as it had so often in Rome's history, struck swiftly. Julian fell in battle against the Persians, his death marking the end of Rome's last pagan emperor and symbolizing the empire's irreversible transformation. With Julian's fall, the empire returned to turmoil. Generals vied for power, each promising salvation and bringing ruin instead. The frontiers crumbled under the weight of invasions. The Goths crossed the Danube, fleeing from the Huns, a storm that would soon crash upon Rome itself. Cities once thought eternal now trembled as armies approached their gates. In Rome, Marcus Aurelius Julianus, now aged and weary, watched as history repeated itself. He had seen emperors rise and fall, reforms flourish and fail, promises made and broken. The empire endured, Yet each generation seemed to fight the same battles, make the same mistakes, and repeat the same tragedies. Rome was eternal in name, but its spirit had become fragile. Constantius's successors struggled to keep control. The empire, now Christian in faith but fractured in soul, faced a new reality. Survival no longer meant conquest, but endurance. The Roman world that once stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania had become a mosaic of shifting borders, fading power, and desperate hope. Rome did not fall in a single day. It did not vanish in one battle, nor crumble under one man's mistake. Rome fell slowly, like the setting sun, its light fading inch by inch, yet burning with dignity to the very end. For centuries, emperors rose and fell. Some fought with honor, others ruled through fear. Generals carved out kingdoms, senators whispered in shadows, and soldiers shed blood for men who promised eternity. But no empire, no matter how vast, could escape the weight of time. When the Huns thundered across the plains, when the Goths crossed the Danube, when the Vandals sailed toward Italy's shores, Rome stood one last time. The walls trembled, the banners faded, but the spirit of the empire did not break. Even as the city was sacked, even as emperors were deposed, something unshakable endured. The idea of Rome itself. Because Rome was never just a city. It was a belief that order could rise from chaos, that civilization could outlast the sword, that human ambition could build something greater than any man. It lived not only in marble and law, but in the hearts of those who refused to surrender to darkness. When the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was stripped of his crown, the world declared the empire dead. But they were wrong. Rome did not die, it transformed. Its spirit flowed eastward into Byzantium, northward into Europe, westward into the dreams of generations yet unborn. Every kingdom that rose after borrowed its laws, its language, its vision. Every leader who dreamed of greatness heard, somewhere deep in their soul, the echo of Rome. The rulers of the late empire had fought not merely for survival, but for meaning. Their victories and their failures were chapters in a story larger than themselves. A story of resilience, ambition, and the eternal struggle between power and purpose. And so, even as the empire faded, its essence became immortal. The roads it built became the veins of continents. The words it spoke became the roots of languages. The laws it forged became the foundation of nations. Rome was more than a place. It was a destiny. And though its banners fell, its spirit continues to rise. In every city that dreams of greatness, in every empire that seeks to endure, in every human heart that refuses to yield. Rome fell. But the idea of Rome, the dream of eternity, still rules the world.